Latinx, a person of Latin American origin or descent, used as a gender-neutral or non-binary alternative to Latino or Latina.
Latinx, we're black, we're brown, we're white. We're immigrants, we break binaries and cross borders. We speak all languages and are of all abilities, faiths, spiritualities, sizes, gender identities, sexual orientations, and documentation statuses, and we're here to stay.
I'm Alejandra.
I'm Ana.
This is Latinx Mental Health Podcast, where we talk to therapists, researchers, artists, activists, and students about their experiences in the intersections of mental health and Latinx identity. In each interview, we aim to connect through our voices, our struggles, and our triumphs, as we sample a different herbal tea, just like Abuela used to make.
In this episode, Ana interviewed fellow co-host Alejandra Spector, community social worker and social justice advocate. We talked about her experience working with asylum seekers at the border, the importance of centering mental health, the vital role that people with disabilities play in social justice spaces, her current work in anti-oppressive teaching, and the importance of creativity and connection as self-care. We drank iced tea with lemon and learned a lot recording our first episode using Zoom.
The Latinx Mental Health Podcast is not a substitute for professional mental health care. We encourage you to seek resources and support in your community.
Hi, Ali.
Hi.
It's good to see you. I wish it were in person.
I know. This kind of sucks.
Yeah. Hopefully we'll get to in person sooner rather than later. Yeah. 2021.
Yeah.
But I'm also grateful that there are ways through technology that we can at least try to continue what we're doing and stay in touch and all the things.
Yeah, I feel like I've learned so much since being in quarantine about how to use computers and not have a total meltdown.
Totally.
Which was kind of my MO before.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It just shows how adaptable we are.
Yeah, there we go.
I would love to start by having you tell us a little bit about your background and how you became a social worker.
So it's kind of a long story. I'm originally from El Paso, Texas, as everybody here probably knows if you've ever listened before, because I go on and on about being from the border. I grew up in El Paso, Texas. My parents were and are both activists. My mom was a union organizer with the garment industry for a long time. And my dad was a labor rights organizer turned immigration attorney. So I grew up in a household where activism was just normal. And yeah, all my life. I was also raised, I'm trying to tell this in a straight line, but it's hard, right? Because nobody's life is in a straight line.
No, that's not how lives are.
Yeah. So activism was a big part of my life growing up. Part of my family's Jewish, part of it's Catholic. I was raised Jewish, and, did Hebrew school and my bat mitzvah and all of that. Social justice is a big part of our religion, or at least the way I was taught in the Reform movement. And I think just having that combination made me very aware of the world around me, of injustice. And I guess in some ways, I don't feel like I had a choice. In the way that like all of our lives sort of lead us down the path that we eventually take. Mm-hmm. And I was also lucky in that the arts were something that was really important to my family. Like I was just surrounded by writers and artists and musicians. My dad had a huge library in English and Spanish growing up in the house. There was a lot of like Mexican intellectuals that would come in. Like my parents had really interesting friends. And so I had just like a really rich childhood, and storytelling was encouraged, make-believe was encouraged. So those are all the real positive parts of growing up in the way that I did. And there was also some difficulties and some hard parts about growing up in the way that I did that I don't want to go into too much detail about, but that also led me, I think, to be interested in mental health and its intersection with social justice. I ended up moving to San Antonio after I graduated from high school and was there for a semester. And then I ran off to South America for about 6 months. I went to Buenos Aires and wrote bad poetry and taught English terribly. I was like a horrible English teacher. And then while I was in Buenos Aires, I applied to UT Austin and majored in Spanish and Portuguese with a minor in geography, and really focused on literature and Latin American literature, which is, I think, literature is definitely my first love, and I think very tied to social work when we think about stories. And then the war on drugs was declared in Mexico. And if you listen to my dad's episode, to listen to that again, or if you haven't listened to that episode, to go back, because it explains a lot about what I'm just going to kind of gloss over. Mm-hmm. But in 2006, the war on drugs was declared in Mexico. And I believe it was in 2009, the Mexican military was sent to the border of northern Mexico. And then basically from there, violence erupted. And this small town that my grandmother is from, and that my father grew up in half of his life, went from a population of about 20,000 to 2,000 in a really short period of time. And my father won the first political asylum case for a Mexican in the 90s. And so he saw an opportunity to really make a difference in the community by advocating for Mexican activists and journalists, starting really with those small communities outside of Ciudad Juarez. And so when that happened, all of our lives changed, because suddenly we were in the middle of this war, for lack of a better word. And so I started working for them as soon as I graduated in like 2011 or 12. I think I graduated in 2012, and I started working for them a little bit before I graduated. And I was their outreach person, which meant that I ran all of their social media, but I also traveled across the country and to different parts of the world talking about the war on drugs. I went on a caravan across the United States with activists from Mexico and the US, and went through the Deep South, slept on church floors, spoke with the press, got our members to speak with the press, organized that. Really, I don't know, I guess my job felt somewhere between like public speaker, war reporter, and social media person. I just kind of did what I could for the organization. And then in my final year working for my parents, and this is really where I became interested in social work and mental health. Not that I wasn't interested, because I've been in therapy for years, and it's always been something and I've been with the same therapist for 10 years. So it wasn't that it was like this new thing to me, but what I saw in my time and the organization was called Mexicanos en Exilio, what I saw in my time there was the impact of trauma on communities. And we knew that we needed help for our clients. But because of the situation, a lot of the local therapists were afraid, because at the time it was still very dangerous. And it was also this, like, we don't know how dangerous it really is. And we actually got death threats for our involvement. So it was dangerous. Understandably. And so, but we couldn't get anybody in town to do it for a price that was affordable, or that were bilingual because of the fear, and just the lack of language abilities. So it was like a group of family therapists this group was started by exiles from Argentina, and they offered their services to us free of charge over Skype. So like we were like the first to do, not the first, but we were like kind of cutting edge in a way. We were doing teletherapy in 2012. before, we couldn't get American therapists to do it because there was no APA guidelines at the time. So I helped run that program for a year and saw the impact, a very real impact on our community of the people who did choose to do therapy and how they benefited from it. And it was after doing that for a year, and also after experiencing some pretty extreme burnout, I applied for UT School of Social Work and I got in. And that is the long and winding part of the long and winding journey to social work.
I'm kind of curious to know two things. One, why you picked social work, because there's various kind of mental health trajectories out there. And also just generally kind of what your experience was like at the School of Social Work, or kind of navigating that education and, what you wanted to get out of it, where you ended up, that kind of thing.
Yeah. So why social work? Something I didn't mention was that the end of our year-long, I guess I'll call it experiment, was that we put on like a symposium for the community at the UT El Paso School of Social Work. And I got in contact with their School of Social Work. And I saw what social workers could do. I've also was never sure that I wanted to actually be a therapist. And I knew that social work would give me more options because, I had this role as an organizer. I was interested in trauma treatment. I was interested in mental health, but I'm still not sure if I eventually want to be a clinician. So social work has really been perfect for me in that way, because I can change my mind.
Yeah, I definitely feel you on that.
Yeah, you can be flexible. You can go in and out of different roles.
For sure.
Yeah.
So was the training and education what you expected? What are maybe some things that you learned or placements you had? What was that like for you?
Yeah, so I feel like I can't tell this story without talking about my health epically falling apart. Because my social work school experience was really influenced by my physical health, which I think can be an interesting perspective because I know that other people are having to navigate this with all sorts of health issues and life circumstances. I got into the School of Social Work, I accepted, and it had been a couple of years, I had noticed that I was just exhausted all the time. And I assumed, rightly so, and this is what all the doctors told me, was that I was just working really hard and I was super stressed out, and I had really weird hours. Sometimes I was working days in a row, and then I'd have days, so I didn't have a schedule. And then there were days where I couldn't get out of bed, and I think everybody just thought I was really depressed. And definitely hearing those stories of trauma day in and day out was difficult emotionally, but it felt really different. Then my left thumb swelled up to double its size for over a year. And I just had aches, and I had a really weird cluster of symptoms. And I kept going to different specialists and different doctors, and nobody could find anything. Finally, I went to an acupuncturist, and they said that it looked like some sort of autoimmune disease. And I was able to get blood tests. And this was in the summer before into my first semester of grad school, when all of this was happening, and when I finally saw the acupuncturist. And so it was, I think, in October of that first semester, I got back blood tests saying that I had an autoimmune disease of some sort. And I wasn't able to get into the rheumatologist until a few months after that, so during the break. And that's when I was diagnosed with rheumatoid arthritis. The diagnosis has since shifted a little bit, but basically I have something that looks like rheumatoid arthritis or lupus. Finally, everything really caught up with me, and I sort of just shut down. And I did struggle. Not only was my physical health struggling, I think just the emotional impact of, I think everything that I had experienced in those years before, I think kind of caught up with me, because I was finally able to sort of rest, and just the having to sort of digest the fact that I had an illness. I've fell apart pretty epically. And that was my first semester. And kind of by the time the second semester rolled up, I really wasn't functioning very well. I almost ended up dropping out of school at that point, but I had a lot of support from a few of the faculty members at the School of Social Work, whom I still have a really high regard for and a relationship with, who really helped me out and helped me get through that first semester. But from that point forward, I had to take several breaks in between, and I was only going part-time. And I wound up taking about 5 years to finally graduate. And so my experience was very different from like the cohort I started with. I wasn't able to I think make as many connections with my cohort and with other people in the program because I was only taking 1 or 2 classes at a time, because I was taking time off, because I had this very full life that revolved around medical appointments and treatment.
I feel like it's really helpful to hear your perspective and your story, because that's not what's often told at the School of Social Work or at many institutions, because the focus is usually on graduate on time and do this and do that, and here's the normal thing or the trajectory. And whether it's because people have kids or jobs or other life things happen, I think more people than we would think can relate to your story. And it's very helpful to normalize all the different paths that we take and what we get from them too, what we learn. I want to kind of think a little bit more about this idea of disability, and more specifically disability justice, because that's something that you've written a lot online about. So I'm wondering if you can share more about what disability justice can really look like and why it's important.
It can look like a lot of things. I think if I speak a little bit about my personal experience, I didn't understand really anything about disability before it impacted my own life. And I didn't understand how people with disability are barred from so many things until I experienced it. And there's so many forms of disability. So I can only speak from my own perspective. Some people have disabilities that you can see. I have an invisible disability. Some people deal with illness. Some people don't. But I think across the board, something that I've heard and seen is that the way that we take up space is different, and the spaces that we're allowed in is different. And I think what people with disability, when they're allowed to inhabit spaces and when we include people with disabilities, I think it creates an environment that's really better for everyone. I think people with disability can teach us how to live with pain and how to accept pain as a part of life that enhances our life. People with disability can teach us how to experience time in a different way, how to rest, how to be inclusive. So I think that when we exclude people with disabilities, we lose a lot of that. And I think people with disabilities can add a lot to movements because of those things.
No, absolutely. And I know this is something we've talked a lot about in different ways too, because this idea of sort of disrupting norms and capitalist structures specifically, and ideas of work and productivity, and how looking through this lens really helps us to think about accessibility differently. And I'm reminded right now of Nethery's episode where she said that if the airplane seat is big enough for anybody, it's big enough for everyone, right? And so, that, like you said, that creating spaces that work for everyone, again, the word everyone is there, right? It also works for people who don't have disabilities and who don't experience other forms of oppression. So I think that kind of envisioning that world is really exciting and interesting to me.
Yeah, and that's why intersectionality is so exciting, right? Because we can look at disability at the intersection of race and class and size, try to create and envision, spaces that are inclusive for everybody, or for most. You can't always accommodate everyone, but you can try. The fact that you're trying, I think, is a different stance.
Right, that's the point.
That means a lot.
Well, and I think expanding our ideas of what inclusivity or accessibility even means, right? So like
Yeah.
sometimes that means you need a ramp and stairs. That might be like the thing people think of first, right? Or an elevator or something like that. But sometimes that means having a place to lie down in the office. Sometimes that means having more flexible hours of work. Sometimes that means making sure your employees are equipped with the technology they need. Like there's so many ways in which we can conceptualize that.
Yeah, sometimes it means interpreters.
So how we can keep sort of disrupting the norms and being really creative about what that can look like. And that it then helps everyone.
Yeah, and maybe like not having a norm. Right? Like that's, if we go back to the intersection with race and we look at, you know, diversity and inclusion, committees, for example, and we say like, and we say, well, diversity from, you know, what is diversity? What is inclusion? Because we're still like talking about the norm, which is whiteness, which is heterosexuality, which is able-bodiedness. When we just kind of get rid of that and we look at it through an anti-oppression lens.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, because it's still like, who's in the room? It's like we have to make this extra effort to include. Yeah, the word include is always a little grating, but like this idea that there needs to be some, it's so hard to like bring people in, or like, I guess we'll listen to you, right? Where it's positioning the people then making that idea of the committee in the same place, like that hasn't moved. Like this idea of who's at the table. It's like, what if there's no table? Like, can we break the table? Like,
there's no table. It's like, there's already like we exist.
Yeah.
We're like already fucking here, man. What? Like, you don't have to go looking for us. We're like here.
Yes.
Yeah, I like that. Like, fuck the table.
Exactly.
No table.
Exactly. Yeah, so taking that like conceptual idea and talking about like practically what does it mean to not have a table? Like practically, like how would we envision our spaces in that way?
So that you don't have to go out of your way. It's already there.
Exactly.
Or, quotation, go out of your way.
Exactly.
And you know, being somebody who has needed accommodations, I can't tell you how demoralizing it is when people act like they're doing you a favor.
Yeah.
Like you're some sort of pity case.
Right.
It's like, no, motherfuckers, like I bring value.
Right.
And it's hard to hold that stance. And I feel like I'm able to hold that stance because of my intersections of privilege, because of my, you know, like there are ways that it's like easier. I think it would just be nice if it were easier to be able to hold that stance.
Absolutely. Well, if you didn't, I mean, what you're getting at is having to like prove your worth as a human. And we shouldn't have to. There should be some basic fundamental acknowledgement, recognition, being of like human value, and that is not going to be affected by whether or not you have a disability, right? That like this concept of like universal healthcare, this concept of universal education through college, all these things are based on this idea of we all have this inherent value, and it shouldn't matter if you have a pre-existing condition. It shouldn't matter how many kids you have, or shouldn't matter X, Y, and Z things. It's like things we all deserve to have as basic human rights.
Yeah, I don't know. I can think of examples, even in the School of Social Work, of feeling like I'm having to beg for my accommodations.
I remember talking about it when it was happening.
Yeah. I'm just like, you're lucky to have me in your class.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Well, and that, like you're, you know, pointing out, gets overlooked in like the mounds of paperwork and negotiating and all the things, right? But the point is that the people who created the class in the first place made it so that it would have to have accommodations for someone like you versus creating it in the first place as a space that would work for everyone.
Yeah. And even in a place like the School of Social Work.
Right. Well, I think all spaces that are part of systems have some of this legacy to them. And UT has a legacy of different forms of oppression as an institution. And so, each department then carries some of that with them. And, our code of ethics doesn't inherently mean that the systems around the spaces within which we work, whether that's a university or an agency or an organization, a state office or whatever, are going to embody whatever that actually should or could look like, right? There's always going to be work to do because of these legacies. But I think people like you and others that are pushing for disability justice and bringing light and also talking about that in intersectional ways are helping to have other people then envision what that could be. That's exciting.
Yeah, I think so.
So, I'm curious to think about what you're doing now and the type of social work you want to do. And we've talked about, you've lived in El Paso, you've lived in Austin, you've lived in Argentina and San Antonio, all these different places. And I know you've traveled a lot.
Yeah.
Brazil, you traveled the world. And you've now had different field placements and jobs and things like that. So I'm curious to know kind of how you think of yourself as a social worker and the work that you want to do.
Yeah. And I think that is ever shifting, and I still don't know what I want to be when I grow up. I like the flexibility of working at an agency and kind of trying to build my own thing. It keeps it interesting and exciting.
That's awesome. I'm so excited to see where this goes. I think it's going to be really great. And of course, it's super needed and relevant always, and especially right now.
Yeah. It was the timing.
So I also want to kind of give a shout out and give you some space to talk about another thing that you've been working on right now, which is your online fundraiser. So can you tell folks a little bit about what that is and how they can get involved?
Yeah, so it's been a rough few months for me. Once we hit lockdown, my health took a little bit of a nosedive, and I ended up in the hospital for about 3 or 4 days. And the medical bills came in, and not only are there the bills from the hospital stay, but there's just also all of the bills that come after a hospital stay with the rehabilitation that you have to do. It's gotten really difficult to pay for them on a social worker salary. And so I was, talking with Anna and also just talking with other friends who helped me put together a GoFundMe to be able to just, raise a portion of the money to pay off some of those expenses. So we started a GoFundMe, and with the goal of about $10,000, we raised almost 7K, I believe, close to 7K. So we're only $3,000 away from hitting that magic 10K mark. And I'm definitely very grateful. I mean, it was just amazing to see my community support me, because it's hard to ask for help. I mean, it's hard for me to talk about this right now, but asking for help and receiving it is a huge, I mean, the money is incredibly necessary and useful, but just seeing the love and support has been incredible. Yeah, we're only 3K short of the 10, and any donation is not too small.
We'll link to that in the notes for the episode, and we'll keep sharing it on Facebook as well. And I think I'm sure a lot of people can relate to challenges, especially being exacerbated during COVID and all the things that we're dealing with right now. And so I hope people can draw also some comfort in knowing that A, they're not alone, and B, that asking for help is okay. And that's how we're going to get through it is as a community and coming together even while we're physically apart.
I think something I've learned from this is that that does take a certain amount of grace to ask for help, and that it's a gift to other people. I mean, that sounds like incredibly self-serving, maybe.
I mean, that's something that's actually been like researched, right? Is like that we feel good helping others.
Mm-hmm.
And I think in an ideal world, like going back to this idea of like, what if we envision this like beautiful world that's not oppressive in these different ways, I think it would be a very communal world. I think we could all agree on that. And that we would all kind of hold responsibility and care for one another in a way that's not obligatory, but in a way that's like toward those fundamental rights and like toward this idea that all of us have a stake in other humans like being okay. And so this is an example of that, and it does feel good to help, and it also feels good to be helped. I think we can still access some of that like communal support and shared like joy and caring that we actually thrive on. Well, so like I said, we'll definitely continue sharing links to that. We're so close. And, we'll keep anyone listening. If you can't donate, you also can help us share the word.
Yeah. And I also, if anybody's interested in taking an anti-racism course, I'll share my contact information.
So folks can get in touch. Given that, we've talked about all the different types of work that you've done in the past, what you're doing right now, the state of the world, just everything. I'd like to know more about how you take care of yourself while you're doing this work.
Yeah, this is something that is ever evolving. I haven't always been the best at this. Some of the ways I take care of myself are eating enough, sleeping, just really like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Yeah, which are things that seem like really basic, but aren't for so many of us. So yeah, sleep's a big one for me. I've always struggled with sleep. I think a big way that I take care of myself is through creativity. I love making things. I'm kind of a crafty bitch. I guess you could say. Yeah, I love making things. I also write poetry and fiction. Community is really important. Friends. My support system is just a huge part of my self-care. I don't know what I'd do without everyone. Yeah, another thing I like, plants, being around plants.
Yeah, I wanna ask more about the herbalism specifically, because I feel like we've hinted at it and touched on it in other episodes, but I think it'd be cool for you to share how you got into it, what your experience has been, what your favorite things are, just whatever you kind of want to share about that journey.
Yeah. Well, it's funny because I went to the Sacred Journey School of Herbal Medicine, shout out, here in Austin, Texas. So I believe it was 2013, and it was like in the middle of all of this insanity that I had the opportunity to do an intensive, I want to say it was 9 months. I could be wrong, but I think it was like a 9-month intensive course on Western herbalism, which is kind of taken from the traditions of like European and Native American and Mexican herbal medicine. So just like it's Western herbalism. So I took a 9-month intensive here in Austin. Then I had the opportunity to basically, I followed around an herbalist for about a year after that and just learned everything I could from her. It's been a part of my life ever since. It was something I was drawn to before then, obviously, in order to I think take the time and resources it took to study that much. I obviously had an interest prior to that. My grandmother has a green thumb, and I would spend time out in the garden with her, and she has an herb for everything. That's where we get our little catchphrase, just like abuela used to make. Is partially my experience with my grandmother.
Is there anything that I didn't ask you about that you would like to talk about, or that you wish I had asked you?
Not that I wish you would ask me. I think something that is important to me is probably let's see, how do I word this? I'm a person in recovery, and addiction has been a big part of my life. And I think for the sake of this interview, I'm okay with not having touched on it too much, but it is, I think, something that I just want to put out there publicly because so many people struggle with addiction. And it isn't something we've addressed on our podcast yet. And it's something that's really important to me that I do want to address at, once we have more bandwidth and we're, up and running again. But it's something that I had a lot of shame about for a long time and that I'm starting to come to terms with. And I think is actually something that makes me now maybe a better human, at least a better social worker, probably.
Yeah. Is there any main takeaway or thought until we have that longer conversation that you would want to just throw out right now for folks, especially given what might be being triggered right now with COVID and some of the impacts of people feeling isolated?
I think most of the people that I respect the most in the recovery world all say the same thing about connection being the antidote. And I'd have to agree. And I think that's why this time is so challenging when we're forced. Some of us are forced in isolation, maybe not complete isolation, but a lot more isolation. We don't have access to our communities. Doing AA meetings over Zoom is not the same. So if you're struggling right now, it makes sense. Yeah, that's all.
Yeah. So this has been fun, even though it's very weird to do this on a screen.
Yeah, it has been fun. I miss podcasting.
I miss it too. I love it. And at least I get to see your living room. So I feel almost like I'm where we usually record.
Yeah.
We have come to the end of our time. So I'm going to change up our last question because you have already answered it in a previous episode when a guest asked us.
Snarkily.
So I'm going to try this way.
Okay.
Is there a particular herb or tea that is meaningful to you for some reason, and why?
Oh, that's a hard question.
But I think the answer can't be all of them for no reason.
Yeah. No. I think I'm going to have to go with mint because it's simple. It's powerful. It reminds me of my grandmother. My grandmother always had mint growing in the garden. And we would always, pick a little bit and put it on our tongue. It's anti-inflammatory. The mint family includes mint, lavender, oregano, all of the good smelling spices that we love to put in our food. It grows like a lot of the members grow like weeds. It's good for your stomach. I tend towards stomach trouble. Yeah, mint.
Awesome.
Just like abuela used to make.
Just like abuela used to make. All right, friend. Well, this has been all the fun. And on the next time, you'll be asking the questions with me.
Yes. I'm excited about next season. I think we have some good things up our sleeves.
We're going to rock it. And yes, we're not going anywhere.
Nope.
And I guess this is a good moment to thank everyone for their patience and for staying tuned as we have explored this crazy time and given ourselves time for our own mental health and for our own kind of figuring out what work and life looks like right now. Yeah. And we, I think, are starting to get back into creativity and play as things that we get to make and create for others. And so we see you and we hear you, and we know that there are many things right now that may be challenging or that may be affecting your mental health, and that there's no shame in that. That is normal. We're all going through it together, and we're all going to get out of this together.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Latinx Mental Health Podcast. You can follow us on Twitter and Instagram at LatinxMHPod, find us on Facebook and YouTube, and subscribe everywhere you listen to podcasts.
Hasta la próxima!